In the later half of the 20th century, there was one picture that you could find hanging in homes across the UK. It was a mass-produced print depicting a young boy, tears rolling down his cheeks and seemingly staring out at the artwork right at you, with forlorn eyes full of sorrow and sadness. But there seemed to be something altogether different about this picture, which only grew in infamy when a national tabloid newspaper took the story and ran with it. Because this painting of the crying boy was said to be cursed, causing devastating housefires that would ravage homes, while leaving the painting completely untouched by flames. But was there something truly paranormal going on here, or is there more to it than that? If you're in any way interested in the paranormal, curses, haunted objects and whatnot, you've probably heard of the Crying Boy curse. It's one of the more famous haunted objects, especially in the UK, but this story is so different from what I thought it was going to be. And it all started in September 1985 when a local newspaper, the Sheffield Star, reported on a pretty weird story. It would have just been a run-of-the-mill house fire. I say run-of-the-mill as if a house fire isn't one of the most devastating things that can happen to your family, but you know what I mean. There wasn't anything particularly out of the ordinary about it. The terraced house in Swallow Nest, which is close to Sheffield and Rotherham, had belonged to Ron and May Hall, and they'd lived there for 27 years. The fire first started when their 25-year-old son David had been trying to cook chips, and it was the fat in the chip pan that had caused the fire. Luckily, there weren't any serious injuries. David had burned his hands a little bit when he was trying to put the fire out with a damp towel, but that was it. However, the kitchen was completely destroyed by fire, and there was a lot of smoke and heat damage pretty much everywhere else in the house. So the Halls lost almost all of their possessions, apart from one item that was completely unscathed by the fire, their print of the painting of the crying boy, which had been hanging in their house. But that detail alone probably wouldn't have been enough to make it into the newspaper if that was all there was to it. I mean, it's a house fire, some things don't get touched by fire if it's away from like the main seat of the fire or something, but it's what Ron's brother Peter, who was a fireman, had said about this particular painting, because the article went on to say that Peter had already warned May and Ron about this crying boy painting, saying that, and I don't know if this is an exaggeration or what, but that every call out for a house fire that he's been to recently has had one of these crying boy paintings hanging up, and that in every single case the painting survived completely undamaged. And that was the reason why neither Peter nor his mates at the fire station would ever even consider bringing one of those paintings into their own homes. And so it was because of that testimony of the fireman that transformed this story from just a simple, oh, there was a house fire here last night in a local newspaper, into the beginnings of the infamous curse of the crying boy painting. On the 4th of September 1985, the national tabloid newspaper The Sun had picked up the story and ran with it, detailing Ron and May Hall's house fire and, of course, the seemingly invincible crying boy painting. And the headline? The blazing curse of the crying boy. And that was it. The wheels were set in motion, because the response to this article in The Sun was unbelievable. That day, hundreds of people who had read the story had phoned in, saying that they'd had their own experience with the crying boy. So the very next day, on the 5th of September, The Sun ran a follow-up story, detailing all of these claims that had come in from terrified readers who all believed that they'd been cursed by this crying boy. There was a woman called Dora Mann from Mitcham in Surrey who had claimed that her house had caught fire 6 months after she'd got her own copy of the crying boy painting. And she went on to say that every single one of her other paintings was completely destroyed, apart from the allegedly cursed one. There was one family whose house had caught fire and they'd had to be taken to hospital for smoke inhalation. And when the dad had gone back home while the wife and 3 kids were still in hospital, he walked into the living room to see that crying boy painting hanging pride of place, completely untouched, on a blackened wall where the soot and smoke had totally covered it. And so that, I can really imagine, would leave a lasting impression on you that something's going on with this painting. Depending on how skeptical you are, you could just think that there's some sort of flame resistance going on there. But if you lean more towards the supernatural, then you could see this article in the newspaper about these paintings being cursed. Let's not forget, this is the 80s, there is no internet, and you can see why so many people were concerned. And after that initial article as well, other readers had come forward claiming that potentially the painting wasn't just cursing people with house fires either. A woman called Rose Farrington, who lived in Preston, had lost her 3 sons and husband since buying the painting in 1959, which is obviously such a tragic thing to have to go through, but she said that she often wondered whether it was anything to do with the painting. And then seeing The Sun talking about it, that would have potentially solidified that theory for her. Other people had phoned phoned in saying that they'd tried to destroy their painting by fire, but that they couldn't. They wouldn't burn. A security guard called Paul Collier had thrown one of his prints onto a bonfire because for some reason he actually had two of these things and he'd left it there for an hour, but when he came back, the fire hadn't even touched it. It was completely undamaged. And there was just story after story like this that people were calling in or writing letters about. Other people who had this painting hanging in their house started phoning in asking what they should do with this painting. They obviously don't want it hanging in their house anymore. Do I destroy it? What do I do? So then the ever benevolent tabloid newspaper stepped in and said, "You know what, guys? That cursed painting, send it to us. We will take the painting and we will destroy it for you. No need to thank us. We will keep you safe from this curse that is plaguing homes up and down the country." And so that's what people did. They started sending their prints of this Crying Boy painting into the Sun's headquarters. And apparently they collected something like 2,500 of these prints. They were stacked 12 feet high in the newsroom. They were spilling out of cupboards and had completely taken over one of their meeting rooms. There were so many of these things sent in by terrified readers. So then on the 31st of October 1985, of course, Halloween, perfect day to tackle a curse, very fitting, isn't it? They took all of these paintings out to a site near Reading and, accompanied by the fire brigade, they piled them all up and burned them on a big bonfire. These unburnable paintings all burned into a charred mess. I'm assuming they must have used like accelerants or something and that's why they burned, but even so, it's still funny, isn't it? After everything that the newspaper has been saying about them. But anyway, the Sun obviously eked out every opportunity from this ritualistic sacrifice of all these crying children paintings, and they'd taken photographers and page 3 girls to go out and make this a seemingly fitting conclusion to the Sun's story. A nice little publicity stunt to round it all off. And so if you don't know what a page 3 girl is, basically the Sun used to have a feature on page 3 where they would print pictures of topless glamour models. So that's what it was, but I don't think they do it anymore. And so as far as the Sun goes, that was that. But the seeds had definitely been sown for this curse of the Crying Boy to take on a life and reputation of its own. And of course, the first question that springs to anyone's mind as they start looking into this is obviously to get to the bottom of the supposed curse. And so we've got to look at the origins of the painting, right? That seems as good a place as any to start piecing together whether this painting is actually cursed or not. And so the painting itself is actually a part of a series of paintings. Apparently there were 65 other paintings in this collection, all signed by a G. Bragolin, with the G standing for Giovanni. Apparently this Giovanni Bragolin isn't actually the painter's real name. He goes by a few, including Bruno Armadio, but it could also be Francois Seville. And the alleged story behind this series of paintings he did was that he would paint the orphans of World War II, as he was painting these in the 50s, so not really long after the war, and then he would sell them to tourists. So that's the official story that's kind of widely accepted as to how the paintings came to be. I don't think we really know with 100% certainty. But the story of the actual subject of the painting, this sad boy, that's even more of a mystery, just adding to the whole mystique of the legend. Because a possible origin story popped up in a book published in 2000, and it was, of all things, a book called Haunted Liverpool by a guy called Tom Sleman. In the book, there was apparently this retired teacher called George Mallory who lived down in Devon, and it seems like in his retirement he'd turned into somewhat of a well-respected researcher into the occult, and in 1995 this George Mallory decided to look into the Crying Boy painting to find out the story behind it, and allegedly he was able to do just that. He traced the original artist back to the guy called Francois Seville who was living in Madrid at the time, and so Francois Seville, you'll know that that's one of the aliases that this painter, Bruno Armadio, Giovanni Bragolin, and that's what he went by. The book claims that Mallory actually spoke to this artist, this Francois Seville, who said that the subject of the painting was a little street urchin who had been wandering around the city of Madrid back in 1969. So that's a little later than the 1950s. The artist had seen the boy, who apparently never said a word, but just had a sad, sorrowful look in his eyes, and decided that he wanted to paint this child to capture that emotion. The story goes on to say that a Catholic priest had warned the painter about this child, saying that his name was Don Benillo, but the locals actually called him El Diablo, the devil, because apparently the rumours were that this kid had been orphaned while he'd watched his parents die in a house fire. Whether the fire was caused by Don himself, or whether he just witnessed his parents die in this fire, we don't know. But now no one will have anything to do with the little boy because wherever he goes, fires seem to break out around him. The artist, he didn't really put much stock into what the priest was telling him, like, surely, how bad can it really be? This kid looks absolutely heartbroken, lost his parents, living on the streets, he'll probably be glad of a roof over his head, you know? So he actually adopted Don. And things were fine for a while. He continued to sell his paintings until one day, for some quote-unquote unknown reason, his studio went up in flames. He lost absolutely everything. Without even a second's hesitation, he blamed Don Benillo, El Diablo, for the fire and kicked him back out onto the streets, where he apparently ran off crying, never to be seen again. But allegedly, the curse had already taken hold of the painter because he was never commissioned to paint ever again. People wanted nothing to do with his paintings, just completely ruined him. A few years passed, and in 1976 there was a violent car crash where a car had hit a wall and exploded into a huge fireball. The driver was beyond saving. He was completely burned and unrecognisable, but allegedly there was a part of a driver's licence that had survived in the glove box of the car. This licence apparently identified the driver as a 19-year-old Don Bonillo. Was it the same Don Bonillo that had been painted those years ago? The story kind of leaves it open-ended for you to decide, but I could find absolutely no evidence of this entire origin story being true anywhere. It's only claimed in this one book. I couldn't find any evidence of this so-called well-known occult researcher George Mallory existing. The painter himself, he's a bit of a mystery, but Wikipedia has Bruno Armadio passing away on the 22nd of September 1981, so if that's to be believed, he definitely wouldn't have been alive to talk to this George Mallory in 1995. And also, just looking at the painting that's allegedly supposed to be this Don Bonillo, if it was painted in 1969, and that Don Bonillo was El Diablo that died in the 1976 car crash aged 19, I know I'm saying a lot of ifs to try and reach to connect this story, but I'm working with what I've got here. That would have made him 12 years old in 1969 when he was allegedly painted. And I don't know about you, I don't see many 12-year-olds, I'm not around kids very often, but the subject of that painting looks a lot younger than 12 years old. So just all around, I don't really buy into this little origin story that was published in the Haunted Liverpool book. If I've missed something though, if there is a really well-known researcher called George Mallory and I've just been completely ignorant, or if you know something about this story that I don't, please do let me know in the comments. But as it stands, not convinced. There have been other theories banded around about the story behind the painting. Some believe that the family put a curse on the artist for painting this child. Others believe that after the painting was completed, the boy died in a fire and now his spirit is trapped in the painting, and seemingly every copy of that painting that was made. But in truth, no one really knows the story behind the painting. Everything seems to just be speculation brought about because of the story of the curse. Whatever the origin story, these paintings were mass-produced copied prints that were sold in shops like Woolworths, like they were cheap, and people, especially for some reason young couples, absolutely loved them, with their popularity peaking in the 60s and 70s. But these paintings done by this G. Bragaline, remember he'd allegedly done 65 of these, there were boys and girls, all depicted as crying, very sad-looking children. So while the curse went on to be called the Curse of the Crying Boy by the newspaper, and there's usually only one painting that's kind of like most often associated with the curse, in reality, there were loads of different versions, girls and boys, that were all lumped in with the same curse. Even some from different artists completely, including the Scottish artist Anna Zinkhuizen. Basically, it got to the point where if you had a picture of a crying child hanging up in your house, you should probably get rid of it as it was most likely cursed. But I mean, come on. Can a painting really curse you to the point where you lose your house in a devastating fire? I mean, a lot of people did, and still do, believe that. But it's not for lack of trying on the fire brigade's part to try and dispel this absolute hysteria that surrounded this painting after those articles in The Sun. Because while there were firefighters who had admitted that these crying boy paintings had been present in a lot of fires, with one firefighter, Alan Wilkinson, claiming that apparently there had been more than 50 quote-unquote crying boy fires since 1973, the fire brigade had categorically stated that in every single case there had been a completely not paranormal cause for the fire. Like the Halls, the first case that was reported, that was just a chip pan fire. The other fires, they were due to carelessness, falling asleep with a lit cigarette in your mouth, faulty electric heaters, just normal standard causes of house fires. So was it just a big coincidence that these crying boy paintings had been present at so many of these house fires? In a word, yes. When I say these cheap prints were popular during the 60s and 70s, I mean they were popular, especially across the north of England. They were in so many homes that it became a case of confirmation bias for the firefighters. They see this particular piece of artwork hanging in fire-damaged homes. It's so common that you notice it more. Eventually you start looking for it, and then you see it even more often. Do you see where I'm going with this? And the firefighters had been trying to tell The Sun this. They'd been trying to get the message through that there was literally no need for this panic around a piece of cheap artwork. But allegedly, the tabloid didn't want to know. Didn't quite fit with the narrative, so that part was conveniently left out. Obviously though, even with what the fire brigade was saying, this explanation doesn't really cover why these prints were seemingly untouchable by fire. The firefighter Alan Wilkinson, his wife, suggested that it was because of the tears of the crying boy that would put the fire out if it ever got near the painting, which is very poetic. poetic, isn't it? Absolutely fits the story here that there's something paranormal going on too. But it seems like, again, the real explanation is grounded in complete stone-cold reality. The Chief Divisional Officer of the South Yorkshire Fire Service, Mick Riley, he claimed that the official explanation was that these pictures had been printed onto this like high-density hardboard, which apparently is very difficult to set fire to, so nothing paranormal going on, it's literally just the materials that the painting is made out of. And so sometimes when the painting remains completely unscathed from a fire, it's because the string holding the painting up on the wall is obviously not fire resistant, so it will be the first thing to snap. So the painting itself would fall onto the floor, usually landing face down, which again would protect the print of the crying boy from being burned at all. But it's really not that unusual for pictures to stay hanging up on the wall as well, even during a devastating house fire, because usually they're nowhere near the seat of the fire where the flame is at its hottest. So there you go. Case closed. But if you've got uniformed officers quite high up the chain of command from the fire brigade telling you 100% that it is nothing to do with the paranormal, why did this story, in the words of the Sun's editor at the time, Kelvin Mackenzie, have legs, and why did it run and run? Because it made a great story. It was relatable. This print of the crying boy, it was in thousands of homes across the country. It played on people's fears that maybe their very own copy of this painting could be the next one to start a devastating house fire. The firefighters initially involved in the story, back when it was just that little article in the Sheffield Star, they'd never called it a curse or a jinx or anything like that. That was the doing of the newspapers. So when the Sun appealed for more people to come forward in their sensational article on the supposed curse, everyone who'd had a fire recently and who also owned this painting put two and two together, perhaps even for the first time, that might never have originally made that connection, and came to the conclusion of, oh my god, this painting is cursed, it caused the fire, and thus starting the mass panic and people phoning in terrified and not knowing what to do with their own copy of the crying boy. And all the Sun is doing is seeing a great story that is getting a lot of engagement with readers. It's exactly like nowadays, when a video goes viral, you'll stick to what you know works and try to get another viral hit. So they just carried on cashing in on this story as long as their readers were interested in it. And nothing keeps readers interested like fear. And then just like any other story like this that has been cemented into folklore centuries before this one, it takes on a life of its own. It's even now still being talked about as the painting that causes house fires. But at the time during the 80s, once interest faded and people moved on to the next big news story, that was it. Until the internet came along and the story outgrew the tabloids that had given it its start, and it again evolved and morphed into the urban legend that it still continues to be. New theories started popping up as people speculated on the blazing curse of the crying boy, with some saying that the artist had mistreated the boy and so now the fires were the boy's way of getting revenge, or that the spirit of the kid really is trapped in the painting and he sets these fires to try and destroy the print and free himself. Some people have even come up with the idea that if you hang a picture of a crying girl next to the crying boy, you'll make him happy as he has someone his age to play with, and so then he won't burn your house down. At no point during the 80s were any of these theories mentioned. These have, as far as I can tell, all appeared in more recent years, just showing the influence that the internet has had on this story. And I don't know, maybe just giving an insight into how the internet has pushed folklore as a whole into a new stage of evolution. And I mean, I have a part to play in this. Like, I'm bringing this story, maybe you have never heard of this before, and so now you know about the curse of the crying boy painting for you to make your own mind up about it. But as for the crying boy himself, he seems to be a very forlorn looking character, and it appears like his painting will probably always have a spot in a paranormal enthusiast's collection, and just depending on how much you subscribe to the curse, he might be found hanging near to a fire extinguisher or two. But what do you think? Is there anything at all to this curse? Could this painting or print of the original painting have caused all of these house fires while escaping completely unscathed? Personally, I don't believe that there is a curse at all. I'm usually a little bit of a skeptic of curses anyway, not saying I necessarily believe, but even with that opinion, I'll err on the side of caution and not do the thing to get myself cursed. I won't clean the curse galleon at the ye-old trip to Jerusalem, I wouldn't sit on the Busby stoop chair, but with this supposed curse, I would be totally okay with having a crying boy painting in my house. That's how confident I am about this not being a curse. Because even if you put to the side that the fire brigade said with absolute certainty there's nothing weird going on with these fires, just carelessness, and that the entire thing was completely spun by a tabloid newspaper, this was a mass-produced, cheap bit of artwork that was hanging as some version or another in houses across the country. Thousands of these things. How many of those prints that were churned out were out there hanging on people's walls that weren't involved in a house fire, and whose owners didn't panic and get rid of them? But you'll never hear about those, will you? Not to mention the fact that if this painting really was created in the 50s and became popular in the 60s and 70s as a print in the UK, the first sniff of a curse wasn't until 1985 when the newspapers branded it as such. And that's why I feel pretty confident brilliant, saying that I don't believe this curse at all. And not saying that I ever will have one of these paintings though, because I don't know what people saw in this artwork. Call me crazy, but I'm not a huge fan of having pictures of upset children hanging up on my walls, you know? Not my style, miserable children. But the whole thing is just really interesting, isn't it? Folklore and legends have always been these fluid, dynamic, ever-changing, evolving things. The story never stays exactly how it was. Bits get added to it and changed as it gets retold over and over again through the years. And way back when, in the medieval times, it was because no one wrote anything down, so these stories would pass through word of mouth, as travellers went from village to village passing on these tales, which might be changed depending on the audience that they were telling the story to, or travellers' own opinions and beliefs. Come forward into the 19th, 20th centuries, you've got exactly like this particular legend that got thrust into the spotlight through tabloid newspapers. People started writing down these stories as they'd been told them, and slowly the story changes again as it gets reproduced and rewritten. And that's how the legend continues to evolve. Nowadays, you've got the internet, with the information being passed all around the world. So there is even more opportunity for the story to get added to or changed every time it gets reposted online. So yeah, I just find it really interesting how these tales originate and then evolve over time. But there are so many cursed and haunted paintings, dolls, objects, things, stuff out there. There are so many I want to talk about. And so if you've got a suggestion on a particular allegedly haunted object that you'd like me to cover, please do let me know. I've got a few supposedly haunted dolls lined up, but anything else, just drop it in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a little like. If you want to support me, the best way that you can is by making sure that you're subscribed to my channel. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. They were stacked 12 feet high in the news poom. What is a news poom? I don't even know where that came from.